It was a few days before New Year's Eve in December 2018, and I had chosen to stay home while my friends went to a party downtown. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes every little sound stick in your ears. The hum of the refrigerator was steady, the radiator occasionally hissed, and the city outside felt far away despite being a block from the main street. I had my textbooks spread out on the coffee table, notes scattered, a laptop open beside me, but I kept getting distracted. I told myself it was just the season, the late hour, the isolation. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional car passing beneath the streetlights, headlights cutting through the foggy winter air. I had been reading for a couple of hours, curled up on the couch with a blanket over my legs. At some point, I glanced up toward the window without really thinking. Across the street, on the sidewalk in front of one of the apartment buildings, I saw a figure standing perfectly still. I assumed it was someone just walking home from a bar, maybe disoriented or waiting for a cab. I waved automatically, a polite gesture, and the figure didn't move. At first, I thought maybe they hadn't seen me, so I waved again, slower this time, but there was still no response. Unease crept in slowly. The figure was still there, and though I tried to rationalize it, my stomach tightened. I set my book aside and leaned closer to the window. The person hadn't moved an inch. I caught a glimpse of the coat, dark, heavy, the hood up, but no other details were clear. I leaned back, trying to convince myself I was imagining things. When I looked again, the figure had shifted slightly, closer to the building entrance. My pulse quickened. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. I stood up and locked the door to the apartment, my hands shaking a little as I twisted the key in the deadbolt. I went around the living room, checking the other windows. The apartment had large panes facing the street, and each one felt like a potential weakness. I made sure each one was locked, sliding the latches, pressing my palms against the glass to feel the cold metal. Every 15 minutes, without fail, I noticed the figure had moved, always staying just in my line of sight. Sometimes closer, sometimes just slightly angled, but always watching. I stopped trying to estimate distance. It didn't matter. The air in the apartment felt heavier as the night deepened. I made myself sit on the couch again, but I kept turning toward the windows. My textbook lay open on my lap, but I couldn't focus. Every shadow outside seemed to stretch longer. Every passing car made me flinch. I tried to keep track of time, glancing at the clock on the microwave. 1:15 in the morning. I called the non-emergency police line, my voice low, explaining that someone was standing outside my building and had been for a while, shifting positions, watching. The operator reassured me they would send someone, but warned that response might take a little time. I stayed by the window, watching the figure's slow, deliberate movements. Every sound in the street made me tense. A dog barking somewhere down the block, the crunch of tires on icy pavement, the rustle of a trash bag rolling across the sidewalk. I considered calling my friends, but the party was hours away from ending, and I wasn't sure what good it would do. I felt trapped in the apartment, every corner a potential vulnerability. After what felt like an hour, but could have been less, I heard sirens in the distance, growing closer. I pressed myself against the couch, peering cautiously out the window. The figure was gone. No shadow, no movement, nothing. The street was empty, silent except for the distant sound of approaching police cars. I stepped back from the window, feeling my hands tremble, and waited as 2 squad cars pulled up in front of the building. Officers got out, moving methodically across the street and checking the area. I followed them, describing the person, the movements, everything I had observed. They took notes, radioed in descriptions, then checked with the neighbors. One of them mentioned that someone had been targeting apartments in the building, waiting for residents to be alone. The pattern was deliberate, they said. A person would appear outside, sometimes just standing, sometimes moving closer, testing the boundaries, the reaction. It wasn't about confrontation. It was about watching, cataloging, understanding who was alone and when. I felt a cold knot in my stomach, the kind of realization that leaves you shaking long after the immediate danger has passed. The officers stayed for a while, patrolling the block and checking the stairwells. I watched from the window, still wary, noting every shadow. Eventually, they assured me the immediate threat was gone and left, reminding me to report anything unusual and to call at the first sign of someone loitering. I locked the door again, double-checked the windows, and sat back on the couch. The textbooks remained open, notes scattered, but I couldn't focus. Every creak in the building, Every gust of wind against the windows made me tense. I felt exposed, even though I was alone, and the city itself seemed suddenly menacing. I didn't try to go to bed that night. I kept lights on, paced the apartment, and occasionally checked the street. The fear was different from anything I had known before, quiet, calculated, and persistent. It wasn't someone chasing me, it was someone watching, patient, waiting for a moment when I might be unguarded. Eventually, fatigue overcame me, and I dozed lightly on the couch, blanket wrapped tightly around myself, lights on, a chair wedged against the door. Morning came slowly. The streets were brighter, less threatening. I left the apartment only to meet neighbors who had seen the figure before, each confirming what the officer had said. It had been weeks of someone observing, learning patterns, waiting for the right opportunity. I stayed home more cautiously after that, never alone past dark, never distracted. Even now, years later, I remember the precision of that night, the slow movements, the unblinking presence across the street, the feeling of being watched. The apartment never felt quite the same. Every shadow on the sidewalk carrying the memory of that December night when I was completely alone and someone had been waiting for me. I moved into the townhouse in early March 2021. The air was still sharp with winter, and the neighborhood felt quiet, almost too quiet, like the pause before something else started. It was my first time living alone, and I had spent the day hauling boxes, unpacking, and trying to make the place feel like home. The house itself was modern, with clean lines and neutral paint, but there was a certain stiffness to it, a kind of polished emptiness that didn't quite feel lived in. I had signed the lease on the recommendation of a friend who lived nearby, and it had seemed perfect: suburban, quiet streets, reasonable rent. I didn't know much about the previous tenant, and I hadn't asked. At the time, I thought it didn't matter. Late in the afternoon, I noticed the holes. They were small, just pinpricks, and in the plaster walls of the hallway leading to the bedrooms. At first, I assumed it was just some damage or old construction imperfections. Then I realized they weren't random. They were aligned. Each one allowed a narrow, almost exact line of sight into the living room, kitchen, and even the hallway to the bathroom. I walked along the walls, squinting through them. The way they were positioned, it was like someone could sit in one room and watch almost every other part of the house. My stomach tightened. I didn't know if the previous tenant had done it, if it was some weird feature of the construction, or if it had been overlooked by the landlord. I couldn't find any explanation. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was imagining things, that maybe it wasn't as deliberate as it looked. I spent the rest of the evening unpacking boxes, arranging the kitchen, and setting up the small living room I had cobbled together. Outside, the sun dipped behind the row of identical townhouses, and shadows crept into the corners of the rooms. I moved cautiously, aware of every creak in the floorboards, every faint hum from the heating system. By the time I went to bed, it was close to midnight. I left the kitchen light on. Something about the empty quiet made me uneasy, and I wanted a small island of illumination. I laid on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and tried to let myself relax. The apartment felt larger at night, every hallway and doorway suddenly more distinct, more defined. Then I heard it, a faint shuffle. I froze. It was light, almost imperceptible, like someone dragging their foot across the carpet in the hallway outside the bedroom. I told myself it was the house settling, that the floors expanded and contracted. But then the whispering started. Faint, indistinct murmurs, not forming words I could understand, coming from somewhere just beyond the doorway. I pulled the blanket up to my chin, my ears straining. The noises would stop when I focused on them, then start again when I tried to ignore them. I got up, thinking maybe I had left a box or a bag in the hallway, and it was moving in the draft. There was nothing. Every room was empty. I moved through the house, checking the doors, windows, closets. Each time I turned on a light, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, just a shadow, fleeting. I would spin toward it and find nothing, just the darkness of the hallway or the edge of the living room. I tried to rationalize it. I was tired. I was anxious. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. Every time I walked past the hallway with the peepholes, my skin prickled, and I felt exposed. Hours passed in this rhythm. Every time I lay down, there was a shuffle. Every time I moved, there was silence, followed by a whisper. I tried to call a friend, just to hear a voice that wasn't mine, but the phone had no signal. I realized later it was just the way the townhouse was built. nestled between two hills and surrounded by dense trees that blocked the signal. I tried to distract myself with music, but even then, the feeling persisted, a constant undercurrent of being observed. Around 3 in the morning, the noises became sharper. The shuffling turned into deliberate steps. They didn't move quickly, but the pattern was precise, almost methodical, pacing along the hallway, stopping near doors, shifting weight as if testing something. I stayed in my room, heart hammering, staring at the door, every instinct screaming that someone was inside. My mind jumped to the peepholes, and I imagined eyes tracking me as I moved, cataloging every corner, every piece of furniture, every shadow. At some point, I realized I could hear the faint hum of the security camera I had installed near the ceiling in the living room. It was supposed to be a reassurance, a silent witness in case of any break-in, but now it felt like an accomplice. The hum stopped abruptly. I waited, holding my breath, listening for any sign it had turned back on. Nothing. My heart sank. Slowly, carefully, I crawled to the bedroom door and peeked out. The camera was gone from its mount. I moved through the house, every step deliberate. Under the couch in the living room, the camera lay unplugged, its lens staring blankly into the carpet. Whoever had been here had known I was alone. They had moved freely through the house, unseen but precise, leaving just enough trace for me to feel their presence, but not enough to catch them in the act. The weight of it pressed on me. The idea that someone could be in my home, watching, waiting, tracing the lines of my life as I slept, was unbearable. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed in my bedroom, lights on, door locked, listening to the house breathe around me. Every creak, every whisper of air through the vents, every shadow in the corners felt deliberate. I tried to focus on mundane thoughts, grocery lists, unpacking plans, work deadlines, but they were chased away by the memory of the peepholes, the shadows, the quiet shuffle of someone unseen. By morning, I couldn't wait. I packed a small bag, left the townhouse, and didn't look back. I called the landlord, explained what I had found, but he was dismissive, suggesting old tenants' pets or drafts. And I realized he either didn't know or didn't want to admit anything. I never returned to that townhouse. The idea that someone had been inside, moving around, observing me without my knowledge, stayed with me. Even weeks later, I would find myself checking locks obsessively, scanning corners for unnatural shadows, thinking about how ordinary spaces can hide threats when no one is watching, yet someone is. The house itself remained pristine in my memory, almost sterile, but I could still feel the alignment of the peepholes, the way they created invisible sight lines into every room. The thought of those small openings, allowing an unseen observer to follow my every move, was something I couldn't shake. I learned that home can feel like safety, but even walls and locks are only as strong as the assumptions we make about who has been there before. I never moved back, never rented another place without checking it thoroughly. The townhouse, the peepholes, the footsteps in the night, they became a benchmark of unease for me, a lesson in vigilance. I kept my doors locked, my lights on, my cameras in place, but the memory of that night never left. Even now, years later, the quiet moments in my own apartment sometimes echo with that subtle shuffle, the faint whispering of someone just beyond view, reminding me that solitude can be a fragile illusion and privacy is never guaranteed. I remember that evening in April 2020 with a clarity that still unsettles me. I had planned a quiet weekend getaway at a remote cabin near a small lake in northern Wisconsin. The plan was simple: 2 nights with my friends, a few hikes, and a lot of time just sitting by the water or the fire. We had arrived in the afternoon, the woods still thick with patches of melting snow, the lake half frozen in places, the air carrying that crisp early spring chill that bites through jackets and gloves. The cabin was small, made of weathered logs with a steep roof and a stone chimney. Its isolation had felt inviting when we drove up, the kind of solitude that promises comfort and privacy. But that evening, the sense of security slipped away almost immediately. My friends had insisted on getting more firewood before nightfall. I stayed behind to unpack some supplies, thinking I'd relax by the window with a cup of coffee, maybe read a little. I didn't notice at first how long they were gone. The sunlight faded quickly in April, and the shadows of the trees stretched over the cabin like dark fingers. I waited by the front door, then paced the small living room. The floorboards creaked beneath my steps, the sound startlingly loud in the quiet. At first, I told myself they were just taking longer than expected, maybe getting caught up in the woods. But as the evening deepened, a subtle anxiety settled in, prickling along my spine. I lit a few candles, placing them around the room. The small flames cast uneven light on the walls, making the corners seem darker, more obscure. I tried to focus on anything mundane, arranging blankets, checking the supplies, even running the faucet to fill a cup. But each mundane action seemed pointless because every few minutes I thought I heard something outside. The crunch of leaves, the faint snapping of twigs. It wasn't steady or constant, just intermittent, as if someone or something was moving slowly around the perimeter. I pressed myself against the window and squinted into the gathering darkness. The forest seemed empty, silent except for the distant calls of birds returning to roost. I kept moving, pacing the cabin, trying to convince myself I was imagining it. I tried sitting in the chair by the fire, hoping to feel calm, but no sooner had I settled than I heard it again, a soft but distinct sound just outside. Leaves crushed under weight, careful and deliberate. I jumped up and moved to the opposite side of the cabin, heart pounding. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer. But the pacing didn't stop. It moved slowly, circling the cabin. I could almost time it. Every few minutes, a shuffle here, a scuff there. I considered calling my friends on their cell phones, but there was no signal. Even if I could reach them, I had no way of telling if they were okay. The forest felt impossibly large and dark beyond the windows. I realized for the first time that I was completely alone. The isolation was suffocating. Every small sound, the wind brushing against the logs, the shifting of the snow outside, the low moan of the chimney, felt magnified. My eyes darted to every corner, every shadow. The flickering candlelight made the walls seem like they were breathing, expanding and contracting with the tiny flames. Night fell fully, and the noises changed. The soft scuffs of leaves escalated to scratches at the walls. At first, it was faint, almost inaudible, like nails running lightly over wood. Then it grew sharper, more insistent. Bangs and thumps followed, sounding like something heavy being thrown against the siding. I held my breath, frozen, listening to the rhythm. Whoever, or whatever, it wasn't just passing by. It was circling, probing, testing. My stomach sank as the realization set in that the isolation I had enjoyed earlier now trapped me, made me vulnerable. I checked every lock, every window, running my fingers along the cold metal bolts. Everything was secure, yet the sound didn't stop. I moved from room to room, trying to maintain some sense of control, checking the doors again and again. I lit more candles, hoping that the extra light might make me feel safer, but the flames only made the shadows more active. I noticed the faint, almost imperceptible scratches on the logs near the windows. They hadn't been there when we arrived. My pulse throbbed in my temples as I crouched by the largest window, staring into the darkness. For hours, I saw nothing, only the trees swaying gently in the wind. And yet, the sounds persisted. Occasionally, I thought I saw movement, a dark shape flitting between trunks, always staying just out of reach, just beyond clarity. Sleep was impossible. I tried to settle against the wall, tried leaning against the door, but the fear kept me alert. Every gust of wind, every settling creak in the cabin made me start. I imagined someone moving silently through the snow, tracing the cabin, watching. I imagined the footprints I would find in the morning, large and unidentifiable, pressed into the melting snow. The idea of them alone, encircling the cabin, filled me with a helpless, gnawing terror. Hours passed. The night stretched endlessly. I had no sense of time except for the dwindling of candle stubs and the slow cold seeping into the cabin. At some point, I realized I had stopped trying to reason it out. I just moved from window to window, listening, watching, waiting. My mind raced with all the possible explanations. Hunters? A lost hiker? Someone with malicious intent? Every scenario seemed plausible and horrifying. The wind shifted occasionally, carrying with it faint smells of pine and damp earth, but also something less definable, metallic, like the scent of iron and blood or rusted metal. I couldn't tell if it was real or imagined. By dawn, the fear had settled into a tense exhaustion. The sky lightened slowly, pale gray shifting to a soft blue, the first hints of sun brushing over the trees. I waited for long minutes before daring to move to the front window. Snow covered the ground, soft and glistening in the early light. And then I saw them, footprints, large, boot-like impressions pressed deep into the snow, forming two complete circles around the cabin before vanishing into the tree line. They were not mine. They were not familiar. I traced them with my eyes, heart still racing, imagining what weight could leave such impressions. The snow had preserved every detail, every ridge of the sole, but there was nothing else. No other disturbance, no trail leading in or out besides the loops around the cabin. I breathed a long, shaky sigh and stepped outside cautiously. The air was cold, biting at my cheeks. I examined the prints closely. They were too large for any common boot I had seen. The spacing between them suggested a person of considerable size, and the double circle indicated intention, not accident. Whoever had walked here had been deliberate, surveying, marking, testing. The thought sent another wave of fear through me, but also a strange relief. The intruder had left without confrontation. My friends returned hours later, apologetic and exhausted, having gotten lost while gathering firewood and losing their way in the woods. They didn't immediately notice the footprints, busy with their own misadventures. I couldn't bring myself to point them out. I didn't want to relive the fear aloud. I packed quietly that day, leaving the cabin with a strange combination of relief and lingering unease. Even as we drove away, the memory of the night and the sound of circling steps remained vivid in my mind. It's been years since that night, yet the memory stays. I can recall every detail. The smell of the pine-scented cabin, the sharp cold of the April snow, the flickering candlelight casting shadows over rough logs, the sound of scratching and thumping against walls that should have been safe. I've come to understand the sensation of being truly alone in a space that feels monitored, tested, where every ordinary sound becomes a threat. And the footprints, they were real, tangible, deliberate. Whatever or whoever had walked around that cabin that night, they had observed, circled, and disappeared without a trace beyond the snow. The isolation of the woods had made it all magnified, every sound and shadow a warning, and I was left with the knowledge that sometimes the forest is not empty, and solitude can be far more dangerous than any human expects. Even now, when I think of remote cabins, snow, and silent woods, I feel the same pulse of unease, the memory of being watched, of being alone, and of the deliberate, untraceable presence that circled me until the first light of day. I remember the night clearly. It was late November 2017, a Friday, and the house was wrapped in a heavy, almost oppressive silence, the kind that feels bigger when you're alone. Our Victorian home in Boston always had that creaking, groaning presence that made it feel alive in the quiet hours. But I'd been in that house hundreds of times, and had always been able to convince myself that the noises were normal, just the settling of old wood. That night, though, the quiet felt different. Thicker. Watchful. My parents had gone to a concert, leaving me with my younger sibling, who was asleep in the bedroom at the end of the hall. I'd spent the evening making sure they were settled, tucked in under a mountain of blankets because the old radiators never quite heated evenly, and I'd finally slipped down to the kitchen to make a snack. The kitchen light cast a warm yellow glow over the tile floor and the edges of the counters, and I had the radio on low, classical music droning softly, as though it could keep the darkness at bay. I was halfway through buttering a slice of bread when I heard it. A footstep above me, faint at first, then another, deliberate and heavy on the floorboards. My stomach tightened. I froze, my hand clutching the knife a little too hard. The attic door was at the far end of the hallway, and it was supposed to be locked. No one else was supposed to be in the house. The thought of someone actually being up there made my pulse spike. I could feel my heart beating in my ears as I strained to hear more. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing except the hum of the radiator and the soft hiss of the toaster heating. I pressed my ear to the kitchen counter, trying to hear any movement. Then the steps returned, slower this time, deliberate, almost methodical. They didn't sound like someone searching. They sounded like someone just standing there, walking back and forth, pacing. I grabbed a hammer from the kitchen drawer. My hands shook slightly, but I told myself I was careful. I told myself I wasn't going to panic. I took small steps toward the stairs that led to the attic, my bare feet silent on the carpeted steps. Every creak seemed amplified in the stillness. My stomach was in knots, but I needed to know. When I reached the attic door, I pressed my ear against the cold wood. The breathing that met me was slow, heavy, deliberate. Someone was up there. I could feel it in my chest, that sudden, tight knot of fear that made my muscles rigid. My hands were slick with sweat on the hammer's handle. I could hear nothing else. Just the breathing, slow and steady, as though whoever it was knew I was listening and was taking their time. I counted to 3, then swung the hammer against the door. The wood shivered under the impact, a dull thud that made the shadows in the hallway flicker. I waited, holding my breath, ready to swing again. Nothing moved. The attic was silent. I forced myself to turn the knob slowly, letting the door creak open just a fraction. The attic was empty. Dust motes floated in the beam of my flashlight, rising in lazy arcs from the floorboards. The boxes of old holiday decorations, the trunks my parents had filled with old clothes and memories, everything was exactly where it should be. No footprints, no sign of anyone having been there. I stepped in cautiously, the hammer raised slightly. Every floorboard groaned under my weight, and I felt my heart thundering in my ears. I scanned the room in the weak circle of light. The old rocking chair in the corner stayed motionless, the window shut tight against the cold November air. I called my parents immediately, dialing the number with hands that refused to stop shaking. My voice was steady when I spoke, I think, but I don't remember exactly what I said. I just know I told them someone had been in the attic, that I could hear them breathing and pacing, that I was scared. They promised to come home immediately, and I stayed in the attic, moving cautiously from one end of the floor to the other, checking for anything at all, that could explain what I had heard. There was nothing. When they arrived, the drive from the concert had been long, but they hurried through the front door, calling my name. I led them to the attic, my hands still trembling. My father swept the room with his flashlight, my mother beside him, both of them frowning, looking for any trace of a person. The attic was exactly the same as I had left it. No footprints, no disturbances, nothing to suggest anyone had been there, except for one detail my father noticed as he shone the flashlight across the floor. The dust on the attic hatch. I had been so focused on the floor and the boxes that I hadn't even considered the hatch. It was normally coated with a thin layer of dust that rarely got disturbed because it was nailed shut from the inside. But tonight, there were prints in the dust, fresh and precise, leading straight to the door. The outline of shoes, small, deliberate, spaced out in a way that suggested careful steps. Whoever had been up there hadn't made a sound when they entered or left the hatch. At least, none that I could hear. My parents were baffled. They searched the house thoroughly, every closet, every corner, checking doors and windows. Nothing was missing. No sign of forced entry anywhere. The doors were locked, the windows latched. The locks hadn't been tampered with. We even called the local police, who came and did a thorough sweep of the house and the surrounding property. They found nothing, no tracks in the yard, no evidence that anyone had entered the house. They told us it was possible someone had snuck in through an unlocked entrance earlier in the evening, but the house had been locked and I had double-checked before starting the snack. We went back upstairs, and I looked at the hatch again. The prints in the dust were still there, clear, as though pressed by someone who had been wearing solid shoes. My parents tried to brush it off, telling me old houses made noises, that I had probably imagined it. But I hadn't imagined it. I remembered the sound of the footsteps, the breathing, the slow, methodical pace. I remembered gripping the hammer, counting to 3, opening the door, and seeing nothing. The rest of the night passed slowly. I stayed with my sibling in their room, door locked, lights on, my hands clutching the hammer under the blanket. I kept hearing the house settle, the old pipes groan, the wind against the eaves, but nothing like before. Morning came and the light spilled into the room, soft and forgiving, and the tension of the night finally started to ebb. My parents stayed home that day, making sure we were okay, but the unease never fully left me. Even weeks later, I couldn't shake the memory. The prints in the dust stayed in my mind. I checked the attic regularly, thinking maybe I had missed something. Maybe there was some explanation I had overlooked. There wasn't. No hidden passages, no gaps in the boards. No way anyone could have been up there without leaving a trace beyond the dust. My parents never fully understood why I was unsettled every time I passed the attic door. Years later, I still think about that night. I think about the slow, deliberate pacing and the breathing. I think about the prints leading straight to the hatch and nothing beyond. Whoever had been there, if it was anyone, had come and gone without disturbing a single thing in the house, except for the dust. They had been careful, deliberate, and entirely silent. And even though nothing was ever stolen, nothing was ever damaged, and no one was ever seen, the memory of it lingers, a quiet tension I can't explain. The house never felt quite the same after that. Every creak sounded heavier, every shadow longer. I kept the hammer in the kitchen drawer for years after, more as a comfort than a weapon, a reminder that sometimes the ordinary can become something uncomfortably precise and deliberate. That night in November 2017, The house reminded me how thin the line is between safety and exposure, how quickly the familiar can become unknowable. And I learned that sometimes, even in the absence of anyone tangible, fear can leave the clearest trace. I remember that night clearly. It was October 2021, the air already carrying that sharp, dry edge that Vermont falls into after sunset. I was home alone in the old family house, the one my parents had owned since before I was born. They had gone on a weekend retreat, leaving me behind to take care of the two cats. I had been looking forward to the quiet, the way the house always felt different when it was empty of people, like it was a living thing that noticed when it had company or didn't. But that night, it felt heavier, tighter somehow, as if the air itself was watching. I had spent the evening folding laundry in the living room. The house smelled faintly of the dryer sheets my mom always used, and the lingering smoke from the wood stove downstairs, though it hadn't been on for hours. The cats were moving lazily between the rooms, one stretched along the couch, the other slinking around the edge of the kitchen. Everything seemed normal, until I heard it. At first, it was subtle, a dragging sound from the basement. Not the usual creaks of the old floorboards, not the groans the house made when settling in the cold. This was deliberate, heavy, like something was being shifted across the concrete floor below. I froze. The cats stiffened, ears angled toward the stairs. My first thought was the furnace, old and noisy, but this wasn't a sound I recognized. My mind raced through all the logical possibilities. Maybe a raccoon had found its way inside before the cats chased it off. Maybe a box had toppled down the steps. But deep down, I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't right. I put the laundry basket down quietly and edged toward the stairs. My phone was in my pocket, battery barely holding at 5%. I debated calling my parents, even though I knew they were too far to do anything that night. The idea of trying to quietly keep the cats calm while explaining to someone that I might just be imagining things made my stomach twist. I slipped my hand over the railing and peered into the darkness below. The basement stairs were steep, narrow, and the single light bulb near the bottom flickered weakly. I couldn't see anything. Then I heard the breathing. It was slow, deliberate, deep, too heavy to be a small animal. It sounded human, or close enough that my body refused to accept any other explanation. I froze, leaning against the railing, trying to convince myself it was one of the cats somehow, their breathing heavier than normal in the cold basement. But no, the cats were upstairs, one brushing against my legs, the other curled on the couch, eyes wide. The sound came from below, and it moved. I retreated to the hallway, moving toward the front door. My parents had a security system, but it was old and I didn't know the code to set it from inside. I considered opening the front door and running, but the wind outside cut sharply, and the dark road leading to the house stretched like a black ribbon through the trees. I would be visible the moment I stepped outside. I wasn't sure what scared me more, the thought of leaving or staying. Minutes passed. I could hear it again, the dragging. Not constant, but intermittent. The sound of something heavy being nudged or carried across the floor, followed by the breathing, low and measured. Every time it happened, the cats jumped, ears pressed flat, tails whipping. My heart kept time with them, hammering against my chest. I tried to rationalize. It had to be an intruder, someone who had slipped in while my parents were gone. But why wait? Why not move quickly, make noise, anything? The slowness, the patience, was worse than action. It made the house feel alive in a way that was terrifying. The walls seemed to shrink around me, the ceiling lower. The familiar furniture, the photos on the walls, the grandfather clock ticking in the hall, all of it felt oppressive, suffocating. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the kind with a weak beam that barely penetrated the darkness. I crept toward the basement door, trying to keep my weight light on the hardwood floor. The cats trailed me cautiously, eyes wide, tails twitching. I climbed the last step, pressing my body against the railing, and shined the light into the basement. The beam caught dust motes, cobwebs, and stacks of boxes my parents had left unfinished at the far end. There was nothing. I froze again when I noticed the floor. Something had left marks, shallow scratches that hadn't been there when I checked the basement earlier that week. The boxes closest to the wall were slightly shifted. I told myself it was probably an animal, something that had gotten in through the small basement window my dad had never fully sealed. But the dragging sound, the breathing, how could a raccoon make something that deliberate, that heavy, that human-sounding? I backed away, trying to stay calm, listening. The taps began next. A soft, rhythmic scratching, like nails rapped against concrete. 1, 2, 3, pause, 1, 2, 3. Each time I flinched. My cats had flattened to the floor, tails flicking in agitation. I wanted to make noise, to call for help, but my phone blinked at me 4%. I couldn't risk it dying. And even if I did, who would come in time? The nearest neighbors were half a mile away down a winding dirt road, and the thought of screaming through that distance made me feel helpless. Hours passed like this. Every sound felt magnified. The house groaned in the wind, the pipes shifted in the cold, but below it all was something deliberate, something observing, something moving. I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, flashlight across my lap, cats pressed close to me. Every time I thought I had grown numb, the tapping started again, closer now. Morning arrived slowly, gray light seeping through the curtains. The basement was quiet. I forced myself to descend the stairs carefully, every step deliberate, flashlight in hand. The scratches on the floor were clearer in the morning light. I could see where something had been dragged across the concrete, a line of scuffs that led to the corner where the boxes were stacked. They hadn't moved far, but far enough that the pattern made no sense for an animal. I called my parents the moment I reached the kitchen, hands trembling. They rushed home immediately, and I explained everything. They insisted it must have been an animal, probably a raccoon that had gotten in through the window. I wanted to believe them, but the marks, the dragging, the breathing, they didn't match any raccoon I had ever seen. We checked the basement thoroughly. Nothing else was there. No footprints beyond the scratches, no evidence of anyone hiding. I double-checked the locks, the windows, the back door. Everything was as it should be, except for the marks and the lingering sense that someone had been there. My parents sealed the basement window, reinforced the door, and promised never to leave me alone again when they went out. I agreed silently, but even after everything, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had watched me that night, that it had known I was alone, that something, or someone, had tested the boundaries while I waited above, paralyzed by fear. The cats stayed glued to me for days afterward. I didn't go down to the basement for weeks. When I finally did, I cleaned up the marks, rearranged the boxes, tried to convince myself it had been an animal, but the sound of slow, heavy breathing in my memory refused to leave. It was deliberate. It was patient. And it had stopped only when the first light of morning came. I never stayed home alone in that house again. The memory lingered in the quiet, in the way the floors creaked, in the cold drafts that slipped beneath doors. Even years later, when the house was empty for a day, I felt the weight of that night pressing down, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying things are the ones that make no noise until they choose to. I was alone in the apartment that night, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. My roommates had gone out to a party, leaving me with the dim hum of the refrigerator and the soft clatter of my fingers against the controller. The game on the screen demanded attention, but there was a rhythm to it I could slip into, a focus that made the rest of the world fade. I had the window slightly open. The winter air was sharp but welcome, carrying the faint smell of wet asphalt and exhaust from the street below. Streetlights outside painted long, shifting rectangles across the floor, and I found comfort in their constancy. I noticed it first as a flicker at the edge of my vision. I glanced toward the window and froze. Against the curtains, a shadow moved, crouching low as if it were trying to keep itself unseen. My heart skipped, but I told myself it was probably a trick of the light, a trick of my own tired eyes. The street outside was empty. The neighbors' lights were off. I knew this building well, knew the rhythm of the windows across the courtyard. Nothing should have been there. But it stayed. Every few minutes it would shift. A shoulder, a bent knee, a head that seemed to tilt just enough to catch a glimpse of me inside. I stopped the game, set the controller on the table, and stared. The movement was deliberate. The more I watched, the more precise it became. I considered the possibility of a branch swaying, or a shadow from a passing car, but the darkness didn't flicker like that. There was focus in it, attention, and that made my stomach knot. I turned on the living room light. The curtains were heavy, but I drew them fully, checking the frame of the window carefully. Nothing was outside. My phone lay on the couch, face up, and I considered calling anyone, but I stopped myself. What would I say? That someone might be outside my window? That sounded absurd, like a prank waiting to happen. Still, I found myself peering at the glass, trying to convince myself nothing was there. Minutes passed. I returned to the game, but the tension lingered in my chest. Every time I glanced toward the window, my pulse picked up. And then I saw it again. Not a flicker this time, not a trick of the light. A crouched figure, low against the glass, just outside. I could see the outline of a hooded jacket, the way the body leaned forward slightly, as if it were watching me. I swallowed, telling myself to stay calm, to move slowly, not to give away that I knew. I considered calling the police, but the rational part of me hesitated. Would they take it seriously? Would they come and find nothing, leaving me embarrassed? I kept the light on, and I moved to the far side of the room, where the sofa blocked the direct line of sight from the window. I tried to focus on the game again, on the tasks and targets, but the shadow lingered in my mind, persistent. Time moved differently then. Every small sound in the apartment became amplified. The hum of the heater, the creak of the floorboards, the soft tapping of rain against the windows. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but deep down I knew. Someone had been outside. Someone had been watching. Hours passed slowly. I checked the window repeatedly, seeing nothing at first, then catching glimpses again, subtle movements that felt impossible to explain. I refused to go near it. I refused to look too closely. I stayed on the couch, flashlight app open on my phone, scanning the courtyard through the thin crack of the curtains. The street was still empty. The building opposite was dark. By morning, exhaustion had pulled me into a light, uneasy sleep. When I woke, the sunlight made the apartment seem normal again. The street below was wet from overnight rain, glistening in the weak winter light. I moved toward the window slowly, almost afraid of what I might find. The curtains were slightly pulled aside, a small shift that I hadn't made. On the windowsill were muddy smudges, tiny streaks pressed into the wood as if someone had leaned close, maybe rested their hand. I knelt, tracing the marks with my finger, feeling the grit of dried dirt, the imprint of shoes that had been there. The horror of the night pressed down, and I realized someone had been outside. Someone had been close enough to touch the window, to see into the apartment while I sat just a few feet away, unaware for hours at a time. I checked every door, every lock. Nothing had been moved, nothing taken. No signs of forced entry. The apartment was untouched, except for the evidence outside. That was the thing that haunted me most. The knowledge that someone could be there unseen, observing, without leaving anything that could be immediately explained. I didn't sleep that day. I kept every light on, sat in the corner of the living room with the curtains drawn tightly, watching. I imagined the shadow crouched outside, patient, persistent, waiting for the right moment. I replayed the night in my mind, every movement, every flicker of motion. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, crouched low against the glass, watching me. After that, I changed my habits. I never stayed alone after dark. I made sure every lock was double-checked, every window sealed. The muddy marks on the windowsill became a reminder, a warning I carried in my mind. I still live in the same apartment, but I never sit near the windows at night, never leave them partially open. The streetlights still cast their rectangles across the floor, but now I avoid the patterns, avoid looking too closely. I know what I saw, and I know it was real. The memory doesn't fade. It doesn't get easier. I will always remember the shadow outside my window, the way it crouched and watched, and the terrible clarity of knowing how close it had been. I remember that night with a clarity that makes the rest of that summer feel muted. It was July 2016, somewhere around 1:30 in the morning, and the house was silent in the way rural homes are when the wind isn't moving and the ocean feels far off but heavy in the air. My family had gone into town for a wedding, leaving me alone for the first time since I could remember. I had the living room light dimmed, a blanket over my legs, the low hum of the ceiling fan filling the empty spaces of the house. I was dozing on the couch, half awake, half dreaming, when it started. It began as a faint scratching at the back door. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling something outside, or maybe a branch brushing against the house. The sound was soft but deliberate, a scratch that repeated in short, irregular bursts. I froze, listening. There was nothing else, only the whisper of the fan and my own pulse. The scratching came again, closer this time, more precise, deliberate, like nails dragged across wood. I knew immediately it wasn't the wind. I knew because the sound carried a rhythm that a branch or a raccoon couldn't replicate, something intelligent in the pauses, the way it started and stopped. I sat up slowly and moved to the blinds, careful not to make a sound. Peering through the vertical slats, I saw something crouched in the shadows of the backyard. It was partially hidden by the low brush and the slant of the porch light, but its eyes caught the dim reflection in a way that made them glow. A deep, unnatural yellow, unnervingly large for any animal I knew. I watched it shift slightly, the movement slow and measured. It didn't scurry or pounce. It was aware. It was looking at me. I stepped back, heart hammering, and the creature didn't move. It waited. I ran to the door and locked it, double-checked the deadbolt, and slid the blinds completely shut. The living room felt suddenly small, tight, like the walls themselves were pressing in. I tried to tell myself it was a large raccoon, or maybe a stray dog, anything that could explain the presence logically. But the memory of its eyes, the way it tilted its head, how it seemed to assess me from a distance, made every rational thought dissolve. I moved to the kitchen and made sure every window was locked. My hands trembled enough that the metal keys felt slippery. After locking the last window, I returned to the couch and sat as close to the center of the room as I could get, away from the blinds. I didn't want to look outside, but the scratching resumed, fainter at first, then louder again, circling the back and side of the house. Every now and then, I thought I caught glimpses through the slats, something low and hunched, moving just at the edge of the tree line. It stayed in the shadows, never coming into the open, retreating when I stared but returning just as quickly to the same spot. Time stretched in a way I didn't understand. I didn't have a watch on me, and the dim light made it impossible to track. I remember counting the minutes by the scratch marks on my nerves, every brush of movement against the porch or the siding making me flinch. It was patient, intelligent, and deliberate. I couldn't hear any growls, no snarls, no sounds of breathing that made sense. Only the subtle scraping, the shifting weight in the dirt, the occasional scuffing of leaves. I tried to distract myself, flipping through the channels on the TV, but the noise of the show was swallowed by the quiet house. Every time I thought I could relax, I would hear the sound again, sometimes from the back, sometimes from the side. It was like it was moving in an irregular orbit, always keeping its distance, but never leaving. I considered calling my parents, but I didn't want to wake them in the middle of the night. More than that, I didn't want to admit to anyone how aware and deliberate it had been. The thought of explaining the glowing eyes made me feel foolish, but I also knew that no raccoon or deer I'd ever seen could do what I'd seen. I sat in the darkness, ears straining. Every noise was amplified, the hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards in the hallway, the distant call of an owl. And then there was the faint rustle, soft but deliberate, as if it had found a way to slide its weight along the dirt without alerting me. My stomach tightened into knots, and I hugged my knees to my chest. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the wet heat of fear crawling along my arms. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, I couldn't tell. At some point, the scratching stopped. I dared a glance through the blinds. It was gone, vanished into the darkness beyond the tree line. I waited for a long time before moving, my body coiled tight against instinct. When I finally stepped outside in the morning, the sun breaking over the horizon, everything looked calm. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, the way it always did in the early summer mornings on the coast. But there, in the soft dirt near the edge of the trees, was a deep indentation where something had crouched for hours, pressed low to the ground. I knelt and touched it. The earth was firm, compacted in a way that proved something heavy had been there. The grass hadn't been crushed like by a raccoon or a dog. This was deliberate, methodical. I stayed in the house the rest of that day, doors locked, windows shut. The feeling of being watched lingered for a long time, even when no one was there. I never saw the creature again, and the indentation slowly softened as rain and wind reclaimed the soil. But I never forgot how precise it had been, how aware, how patient. For years, whenever I walked through a quiet forest or a dark backyard, I felt the memory of that night pressing against me. The awareness of something moving just at the edge of your vision, calculating, deliberate, waiting. The rational mind wants to categorize it, call it a wild animal, call it imagination. But I remember the shape, the posture, the deliberate intelligence in those yellow eyes. And no matter how hard I try, I can't convince myself that what I saw was anything but real. The experience changed the way I understood being alone. I learned that silence isn't empty, it's observant. That shadows can move with purpose, and patience can exist in forms you don't expect. And I learned that some nights, some hours, some presences don't leave a trace you can see with your eyes, only with the feeling that someone, or something, was there waiting, watching, aware of every move. The memory of that night is still vivid, and the indentation in the dirt remains, in my mind, unchanging, a permanent mark of what it means to be completely alone and known. The first thing I noticed when I got home that evening was how quiet the house felt. It wasn't the kind of quiet that comes from an empty house at night with everyone asleep. It was heavier, deliberate, almost suffocating. I had moved into this place only a few weeks earlier, a small brick townhouse on the edge of a suburban neighborhood in Pennsylvania. The rent was reasonable, the layout compact but comfortable, and the previous tenants had left it in decent condition. Nothing seemed off until that night, but I remember thinking as I carried in the last box that it already felt a little too still, like the walls themselves were waiting. I froze. My apartment wasn't old, not in a historical sense, but there were elements that creaked with age, like the floorboards and the doors. Still, this sounded different. Slower, deliberate. My heart picked up pace. I reminded myself I was alone. There was no one else in the house. My parents lived several states away, and none of my friends were close enough to be wandering around uninvited at this hour. I knew it, but knowing it didn't make the sound any less real. I set the dish I had been holding on the counter, the ceramic tapping lightly against the granite. I moved toward the basement door, the air around it cooler, damper than the rest of the house. My fingers brushed the handle. The wood felt solid and cold. I pressed my ear to the door. The scratching had stopped. Then I heard it again, softer this time, almost inaudible, a dragging, scraping motion, slow and deliberate, like something was being pulled across the concrete floor down there. I stepped back. I tried to convince myself it was a rat or a stray animal, something small. The house wasn't in a fully urban area. There were woods not far behind the townhouse, and animals occasionally found their way inside. That thought didn't help. Something about the rhythm of the sound didn't match a rat. This was larger, heavier, more intentional. I remembered the flashlight I had left on the counter. I grabbed it and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the wooden stairs leading down. Dust motes floated in the light, catching for a moment before drifting back into shadow. I told myself I'd just take a quick look, make sure everything was fine, then go back to unpacking. I gripped the railing and started down. Each step creaked under my weight, each one echoing into the darkness. The basement smelled faintly of damp cement and old insulation. The scratching had stopped entirely. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, the flashlight beam sweeping across the space. Boxes from the previous tenants were stacked against the walls. Shelves lined one side, covered with dust. Everything seemed untouched. I ran the light along the floor, the walls, the corners. Nothing. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place. My chest tightened. I had been holding my breath. I let it out slowly. I convinced myself it was nothing, then began the climb back up. Halfway up, I froze again. The sound was back. This time it wasn't from the basement. It was coming from the living room. A soft scraping, rhythmic and deliberate, like something was being dragged across the floor. My stomach dropped. The boxes I had set down were in a neat line where I had left them. I hadn't dropped anything. The sound was slow, methodical. I moved toward the living room cautiously. The hardwood floor reflected the light from the hallway. Shadows stretched along the walls. I reached the living room, and the scratching stopped again. I spun around, the beam of the flashlight slicing through the darkness, illuminating every corner. Nothing. The windows were closed. The door to the kitchen was shut. Nothing seemed out of place. I put the flashlight down on the couch and tried to steady myself. I ran my fingers through my hair, feeling a thin layer of sweat along my forehead. My heart was still racing. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Someone was in my house, maybe not, maybe just a sound. The thought didn't bring relief. I could feel the tension in the air thickening, pressing against my chest. I decided to check the locks on all the doors. Front door, back door, sliding patio door, all secure. I checked the windows. Secure. Nothing obvious. I went back to the living room and sat down. My hands shook slightly as I picked up my phone to check the time. 3:15. 15 minutes had passed, but it felt like hours. I tried to remind myself I was safe. The house was locked. I was careful. Still, every creak of the floor, every sigh of the walls made me flinch. I tried to distract myself. I poured a glass of water and walked slowly to the kitchen, listening for any sound. The faucet ran, steady, filling the glass. I set it down and took a sip. That's when I noticed it. A faint smell, Not quite putrid but sour, almost like someone had been in the fridge and left something to rot. I frowned. Everything in the fridge was mine, nothing out of place. I leaned down, checking behind the fridge. Nothing. I straightened up, feeling exposed in the empty kitchen. Then I heard it again. A thump, heavy and slow, coming from the ceiling above. My bedroom was upstairs. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. My pulse spiked. Another thump, then a dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the floor above. It moved, then stopped. Then moved again. I ran to the stairs, my feet barely touching the steps as I climbed 2 at a time. The dragging sound was above me now, closer to my bedroom. My apartment had carpet upstairs, which made the sounds muted, but still distinct. I reached the top and froze. The sound had stopped. Silence. Complete silence. I didn't move for several minutes. I tried to convince myself it had been the wind, the house settling, something ordinary. Then I heard it, soft, deliberate, a faint scraping at the top of the hallway. My bedroom door was closed. I could see the doorknob moving slightly, like someone had brushed against it. My chest tightened. My hands shook. I grabbed the baseball bat I had set by the door when I moved in. I stepped into the hallway, careful not to make a sound. The scraping stopped again. I swept the bat in front of me, my feet moving slowly toward my bedroom. The door was closed. No sign of forced entry. I reached out and pushed it open quickly. Empty. The bed was neatly made, the closet doors shut. Nothing. Nothing had moved. I felt dizzy, my legs weak. I left the bedroom and went to the second room down the hall, my parents' old lamp from the moving boxes illuminating the space. Empty. Then the bathroom. Empty. I moved to the far end of the hallway. The scraping started again, low and deliberate, from the direction of the closet near the stairs. My heart was hammering. I approached slowly, swinging the bat just in case. I opened the closet door quickly. Empty. Nothing inside. The scratching stopped. Silence. My legs gave out, and I sank to the floor, the bat still in my hands. I tried to calm my breathing. Tried to tell myself it had been my imagination. But it wasn't. Something had been in the house. I stayed on the floor until the sun started rising. By then, I could see every corner of the apartment in the pale morning light. Nothing was moved. Nothing obvious. But I didn't sleep that night. I didn't leave my bedroom. I called my parents as soon as they woke, telling them what had happened. They tried to comfort me, suggesting it had been an animal or a combination of stress and new surroundings. I wanted to believe them, but I couldn't. A few days later, I went through the apartment carefully, checking every vent, every window, every potential point of entry. Everything was secure. I even checked behind the walls where I thought I heard noises. Nothing. I installed extra locks and motion sensor lights outside. I spent the next few nights sleeping with the doors locked, the lights on, the bat within reach. I never saw anyone, never caught anything. Eventually, I settled into the space. The noises never came back, at least not in the same way. But every time I walk through that apartment, even now, years later, I feel the weight of that night. The house is quiet, ordinary, filled with my things, but I remember the way the air felt heavy, the way the floorboards creaked, the way the walls seemed to watch me. I never found an explanation, but I learned to live with it. The house is mine now, and I know the boundaries. But I never underestimate the silence, and I never leave the doors unlocked. The memory of that night is enough to remind me that even in familiar spaces, things can be wrong, and sometimes the world isn't as safe as it seems. Even now, if I hear a thump or a scrape in an empty house, I freeze. I know the sound isn't always imagination. I know it can be real. I learned that in the long hours of the night, when I was truly alone, and nothing made sense except the sound and the fear it carried. And that knowledge stays with me. I will always remember the first night I was completely alone in that house. The routine, the familiarity, the comfort of my own space, all of it became tainted with that memory. I couldn't explain it, and maybe I never will. I moved carefully, secured my home meticulously, and learned to trust my instincts. The house remains quiet most of the time, but I walk its rooms with awareness. I check the locks twice, I make sure every window is secure, and I never, ever underestimate a sound in the night. That night changed how I approached my own space, my own safety. The ordinary things, a locked door, a closed closet, a quiet floor, took on new significance. I became alert, cautious, deliberate. It wasn't paranoia, just a new respect for the unpredictability of being alone. The strange thing is, after that night, the house never again revealed any intruder. No one returned. Nothing moved. No evidence remained. Yet the sensation of being watched, of something shifting just beyond perception, lingered for weeks. Months even. I grew accustomed to it, but I never grew comfortable. That first night left a mark, a quiet, lingering fear that isn't dramatic or obvious, but is persistent. Now, years later, when I enter that townhouse, I feel the difference between day and night, between light and dark, between occupied and truly alone. It is subtle, almost imperceptible, but it is there. The house is mine, and I am safe, but the memory reminds me that safety is a construct, fragile and easily disrupted. That night was the first real confrontation with the unpredictable and the unseen, and though it left no physical trace, it shaped the way I inhabit my space forever. I cannot explain why it happened, nor can I prove it did, but I remember every sound, every motion, every heartbeat of that night. I remember the draft near the basement, the movement of the doorknob, the way the floorboards groaned. I remember the silence after each noise, the tension in the air, the way my own fear amplified every mundane sound. And I remember the relief of sunrise, the certainty of light, and the understanding that some things can never be fully explained, only endured. It was a single night, yet it lasted a lifetime in its effect. I learned to move through my home deliberately, to respect the quiet, and to acknowledge that even in familiar surroundings, the unexpected can happen. That knowledge has never left me. It is precise, unrelenting, and entirely real.